I love horror movies, so for October, I've decided that I will challenge myself to watch one horror movie every day of the month. I will compile my brief, scripted thoughts on all of the movies I watch during the month in weekly videos. I would do daily videos to keep you guys better updated, but I don't want to bomb anyone's subscription feed. Now, I will set a few rules for myself so I don't cheat. The movies I watch must either be horror movies, thrillers, or mysteries, since all those genres seem to meld together often. They can also be horror-themed comedies or musicals. The only exception for this rule is theatrical releases. Joker is not a horror movie, but I will be seeing it in a theater, and if I can't also squeeze in a horror movie that day, I think it's okay to give myself a pass. Either way, I still have to include whatever movie I saw that day in my weekly video. I'm also allowing myself 3 days that I can miss without watching a movie without considering this challenge a failure. But I can also make up for missed days by watching more than one horror movie in a day. The ultimate goal here is to be able to have watched 31 movies by the end of the month. All that being established, let's get started with week 1. Today, I watched the silent film classic, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This film comes from the part of film history known as German Expressionism, which was not only instrumentally important for the development of cinema, but basically established the genre of horror as we know it. This movie, along with F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, which I've already seen, are frequently cited as the very first horror movies. I had been meaning to see Dr. Caligari for a long time, so I figured I'd start the month out by watching it and appreciating the roots of the horror genre. I really enjoyed this movie. That being said, this is a silent film, so this isn't really a film I enjoyed on an entertainment level. This is a movie you watch to appreciate on a more scholarly level, to appreciate its impact on film history. At least that's how I approach this movie myself. I was constantly picking this movie apart in my head, making connections to the many films it had influenced. While I didn't find the story or characters here engaging, you can definitely see elements of supernatural horror, slasher films, and monster movies scattered throughout its plot points. But what I really enjoyed this movie for is its visual presentation. Visually, this movie changed movies forever, and it's not hard to see why. This movie is nearly 100 years old, and it still looks incredibly beautiful and unique. The lighting in this movie is very harsh, with deep shadows that are further exaggerated because many times they're painted directly onto the sets. The sets themselves are very dark and gothic and made with very strange angles that give the entire movie this weird look. You can easily see how all of this not only helped to establish the horror genre, but also went on to inspire the visual style of other genres like film noir. The costumes and the makeup were also really great, and another visual aspect that I really appreciated. All of these visual aspects came together and helps the movie feel like it was in its own world. This is also a very early example of color in film, as certain scenes are tinted different colors depending on the setting and the mood of the scene. So yeah, I clocked out mentally from following the story every now and again, but the visuals of this movie really struck a chord with me and kept me engaged throughout its runtime. And since all silent movies are just pure visual storytelling, this is basically an ideal experience for me. I think I can confidently say that this is probably my favorite silent movie behind Metropolis. Today I watched The Host and The Conjuring. The first movie I watched was The Host. This is a Korean movie by Bong Joon-ho, the same director behind Parasite, a fantastic movie that's probably the best 2019 release that I have seen so far. And unsurprisingly, I really liked The Host as well. It's a creative monster movie that has a lot of the same things going for it as Parasite did. It's beautifully shot, has great acting, and has a really strong grasp on its story and characters. The special effects for the creature hold up surprisingly well for a movie that's 13 years old. There are still a few scenes in this movie where the creature looks more convincingly real than other CGI monsters in more recent movies. Obviously, this praise does not extend for every scene because CGI was not as advanced in 2006, but as I said before, it holds up way better than it should have. This movie does what a lot of other horror movies try to do and fail, especially in setting up its cast of characters. By the time the monster starts terrorizing the city, you've already formed a connection to this family. That means when the intense scenes of suspense start happening, you're a lot more invested than you would be otherwise. Despite being a horror movie, this movie also works really well on the level of a character drama. All the relationships between the members of this family are really well fleshed out and explored. Every emotional beat in the story hits like it's supposed to, and it is very effective. The movie has some really nail-biting moments in it, and those are only as effective as they are because it does such a good job of attaching you to the characters beforehand. If I have any problems with this movie, it's in its story. Don't get me wrong, the story here is pretty creative and not at all typical of the genre. However, I do feel that the movie sagged a bit in the middle part of the story, and it got kind of dull for me. The dullness in the second act is more than made up for in the climactic third act, though. It is a fantastic payoff to the build-up of the movie and proves that Joon-ho is a master of suspense. There were also a few small plot points that I felt were kind of predictable, but that again is made up for with all of the other unpredictable places this story takes you. Overall, I think this is a great movie, and I highly recommend it for anyone who has not seen it. I also rewatched The Conjuring. Since this movie was released, it's become something of a modern horror classic. It came out at a time where the only movies that were really coming out were really shitty sequels and remakes. And this movie was a breath of fresh air at the time. And for a long time, this was the horror movie that you had to see. I mean, this was a movie that had an R rating for no other reason than it was just that scary. So this movie had, and still has, quite the reputation. Returning to this movie years later, I don't think it's as effective as it once was when it first came out, and in comparison with more recent movies like Hereditary and The Witch, it definitely doesn't seem as fresh and original. But this is still, nevertheless, a really fun horror movie that works most of the time. James Wan once again made a really good horror movie that inspired a franchise that pales in comparison. Just like the Saw franchise, what makes this movie work where the other Conjuring universe movies fail is James Wan's direction, which is really creative and adds to the intensity. He doesn't reinvent the wheel here. Like I said, it's not as fresh and out there as something like The Witch, but he knows what works in horror movies, and he just leans in to what has already worked in other horror movies. He's proven in recent years that he can direct a really entertaining action blockbuster, but I still think horror is his strong suit. I'm not sure if it's hyperbolic to say that this is the Exorcist of this generation, but its legacy certainly feels that way. In any case, I still really like this movie. Today, I watched Wreck. Wreck is a found footage movie from Spain about a TV crew documenting the lives of firefighters for a late night news show. The firefighters get called to a building where things go terribly wrong, and after that it becomes a game of survival. That's all I'm going to say about the plot because I didn't know anything about this movie going in, and the story really surprised me. It's super creative and constantly ramps up the tension to keep you on the edge of your seat. Do not let anyone tell you what this movie is actually about, because when the movie finally revealed its true nature, I thought it was a really cool and creative turn of events, but it won't seem that way if you already know what the movie's actually about. It solves the main problem of the found footage genre right off the bat by having the main characters be part of a news crew, so they actually have a good reason to document everything that's happening. I had a ton of fun watching this. I expected something completely mediocre, and instead I got something that was actually pretty great. I highly recommend this movie, and do not let the plot be spoiled for you. This is best experienced as a blind watch. Today I watched The Devil's Backbone. This was directed by Guillermo del Toro, who you probably know from movies like Hellboy, Pan's Labyrinth, and The Shape of Water. It follows a young boy in an orphanage as he tries to uncover the mystery of the ghost that haunts its premises. I enjoyed the movie, but I don't feel there's a lot to say about it given the nature of this director. If you're familiar with the works of Del Toro, you know exactly what you're going to get with this movie. Devil's Backbone is a bit different though, because it was an earlier film in his career, so it's quite a bit smaller in scale than his other movies, and you can tell that he was still sort of coming into his own style. Regardless, there's still plenty here that you'll like if you like his other work. It's got good characters, an engaging story with interesting themes, and good makeup and special effects, even if there is less of them in this than in his other movies. Since this is a horror movie, this also has some pretty effective creepy scenes in it, similar to but not as quite as good as the ones in Pan's Labyrinth. If you like Del Toro's other stuff, you'll probably like this too, and it's a pretty good watch, so check it out. Today I saw Joker, and I really liked it. Todd Phillips directed this movie, and I gotta say, it's probably his best. I've always liked the first Hangover movie, but I hadn't really seen anything else that he had directed, so I decided to watch his last movie, War Dogs, a couple of weeks ago, and I was pretty indifferent on it. It felt very derivative and like I'd seen the same movie before, but done better. Thankfully, Joker is a lot better than War Dogs. That is not to say that it is entirely original, as many have pointed out it still borrows from Scorsese, but it's original enough not to be called a ripoff. Though that has not stopped some people from accusing it of doing just that. I think it's ironic that the people accusing this movie of being a ripoff are some of the same people who endlessly praised Midsommar, a movie that I couldn't bring myself to like because it's so blatantly borrowed from The Wicker Man that it might as well have been a remake. It's also ironic that the same people who accused comic book movies of not being stylish enough are now not satisfied when a stylish comic book movie comes out. My point in all of this is, people who complain about comic book movies really get on my nerves, and I'm getting really sick of it. Anyway, I think this movie was really good. I'm not going to be redundant by repeating the exact same praises as everyone else. Of course, Phoenix is great as the Joker, and of course, this movie looks great. Again, this is the stylish comic book movie people have been asking for. Phillips may borrow some things from Scorsese, but his visual style is definitely his own. I don't feel the need to go through everything I liked about the movie because it wouldn't be all that different from what any other YouTuber has to say in praise of it. What I will say about it though is that this movie had a deep impact on me. It left me unsettled for hours after I watched it, and I love that it was able to do that. I don't think this movie could have come out at a better time. This is a movie that is about political unrest and extremism, resentment between groups, mass murders, and violent protests. It's a movie about lonely people released at a time where loneliness is both an epidemic and incredibly stigmatized. And all of this is wrapped inside of a comic book origin story. This is the most 2019 movie I have seen in 2019. This movie pretty well encapsulates the climate of America and the rest of the Western culture right now. And I think that's why it's causing so much controversy. It really hits home in an uncomfortable way, and not everyone is going to want to feel that way. I really liked Joker, and I'm sure by the time I release this video, all of you will have either already seen it or decided whether or not you want to see it. So there's really no point in me recommending it. Now, let's get back to watching horror movies. Today, I rewatched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is one of my favorite horror movies ever. It is absolutely legendary, and for a reason. This movie is 45 years old, and it is still crazy, visceral, and terrifying. Although, there is one part in the movie that I can't completely take seriously because it reminds me too much of the SpongeBob episode where they tell Squidward to firmly grasp it.
Firmly grasp it!
If you've seen the movie, you probably know what part I'm talking about. Anyways, it had been a few years since I saw this for the first time, but I still remembered much of it vividly. This movie is like a terrible nightmare in the way it permanently scars your memory. Rewatching it, I was able to appreciate the filmmaking a lot more since I wasn't so engrossed in the horrific events of the movie. The directing here is fantastic, and I don't think I noticed that as much on my first watch. There are some really beautiful shots here, but most of them are intentionally very claustrophobic, with increasingly paranoid editing during the third act. The soundtrack for this movie is great. It is full of unnerving, eerie sounds that would scare the shit out of you if you heard them in the middle of the night. It's a movie with a very clear message about animal cruelty. All the characters die in ways that parallel how humans kill animals. It's a movie that's about dumb teenagers, but unlike a lot of similar horror movies, they're not so dumb that they basically kill themselves by making dumb decisions. All the people who die in this movie are just victims of unfortunate circumstances beyond their control. Again, this is much like animals that are slaughtered. I could say so much more about this movie because it really is one of my favorites, but I have to move on because the reason I rewatched this was to watch the 2003 remake and compare it with the original. I've never bothered to watch any of the various remakes and sequels of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre because I've always assumed that all of them were dog shit. But the 2003 remake actually has quite a few defenders. I saw a number of people calling it good, so I decided I'd check it out and see for myself. And after watching it, I gotta say, this movie is dog shit. This movie is worse in every way than the original, and not by a little bit, by a lot. This movie is not scary at all. It relies on jump scares that aren't even effective at startling you, and cheap editing tricks. There's no tension in the movie at all. The kills aren't visceral or memorable, in fact, most of them are pretty stupid. The script and dialogue in this movie are awful and the direction is considerably worse. The entire movie looks really ugly with a dark, desaturated color palette. This is a movie that is supposed to take place in the 70s, but absolutely feels like it was made in 2003. Everything, from the way the characters talk to how they're dressed, feels like it's set in 2003. Look at these outfits. Do these look like they're from the 70s to you? Let me answer that question for you. No. The subtext about animal cruelty is completely gone here. Any imagery related to it is basically used as window dressing because I guess the director thought it was a cool aesthetic. All of the changes made to the characters and story detract from the movie's overall effectiveness. The teenagers in this movie are exactly what the teenagers in the original were not. They're loud, obnoxious, woefully stupid, and they make empty-headed decisions that actively put them in danger, as if they are trying to kill themselves. The only good thing about this movie is that R. Lee Emery from Full Metal Jacket is in this movie, and he gives the only good performance in it. This movie was boring and dumb, and I couldn't wait for it to be over. The most entertaining thing about it was watching the lead actress's boobs bounce around whenever she ran around in her needlessly tight tank top. This movie is straight garbage. There's no reason you should watch it, and there's plenty of reasons why you shouldn't watch it. So do yourself a favor and don't. Today, I watched The Innocence. This movie is about a governess who is taking care of some children, and she comes to believe that their mansion is haunted. This movie is gorgeous. Every shot looks great. This was shot in CinemaScope, something that was invented at the time to keep people coming back to the theater after TV became really popular, and the whole movie as a result just looks grand. This movie is effectively creepy and tense. It has a way of building an uneasy atmosphere and setting you on edge. There are images from this movie that I'm going to remember for a long time because they were just that eerie. All of the acting is fantastic, the main actress knocks it out of the park, and even the child actors do a really good job. This is one of those horror movies that has a creepy ending that's also left open to interpretation. You can interpret the entire movie differently by how you view the ending. I hadn't heard much about this movie before I saw it, and I wonder why horror fans don't talk about this movie more, because it's really great. Definitely check this one out if you haven't seen it. Well, that's it for week 1 of my Spooktober challenge. Stay tuned for week 2 for my thoughts on even more horror movies. As always, I'm Randall the Vandal, and thanks for watching.